So nice to talk about this to such a packed room. Um, so I'm going to talk about collective bargaining in the auto industry, 2023. I'm going to compare two unions, Unifor and the UAW. Um, so if you were in the United States during this collective bargaining round, you might have heard this narrative that the Auto Workers Union has revived itself. It has democratically elected leadership. They're progressive and they're militant. Um, and they go on strike for several weeks and they use a different strategy than the previous regime. They make major gains in terms of wages. They also win investment guarantees and other things that are relevant specifically to the topic of this session, the green transition, because these companies are planning to switch from making internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. And so it sounds like a very optimistic story, unless, like us, you're a comparativist and you spend lots of time with this union and you realize that it is relatively chaotic and has a lot of difficulty when it comes to uh, coming up with a strategy. Um, I'm really glad that Fred Wilson is here too, because Mathieu and I and Dongwoo have learned a lot from talking with him and from reading his book. Um, so, um, so the EV transition in North America sort of started in 2019, at least in the unionized sector. Um, this makes a few differences for auto workers. Existing assembly plants are supposed to be converted to manufacture EVs. There's supposed to be new kinds of work, making new kinds of parts, such as batteries, normally in joint ventures with non-union companies, often based in Asia. Um, and the there's a restructuring of plants making components for internal combustion engine vehicles so that they're supposed to be making parts for EVs. So what's the impact of this? Well, it's not, I mean, the unions don't have a clear jobs versus the environment narrative about this. They want it to happen. They want to get the investment, but there are real risks that they talk about. Job losses for existing workers. They're worried about worse jobs making the new kinds of parts, especially in joint ventures. And I would say in general, for auto workers, not just in North America, there's a concern that manufacturing workers are going to continue to experience the downward social mobility that they have endured for the past couple of generations. Um, Whether this happens depends on all kinds of factors, including what unions do. The problem in North America, though, is that the unions lack the institutional power resources to really promote a just transition. And so they have to find other power resources. So this is a direct comparison with the German case that Gerhard talked about. So the 2023 bargaining round was kind of a critical moment in this process. So the union's demands in both the US and Canada were for improvements in wages and benefits, the end of tiered wage structures, which left people with less seniority behind. Um, and it was a transition to EVs that did not shift the risks and costs onto workers. What Sean Fain called a just transition, and what some people also in Unifor call a just transition. Um, so this all happened, but it has a backstory that I think is really important to understand what happened and also to understand what is going to come next. So there's a lot of turbulence in both of these unions that really affects their ability to function. Um, the UAW was facing an anti-corruption inquiry. Top leaders went to jail. New leadership was voted in. Um, there were plant closures of EV that the companies said were caused by EVs and the need to save money to invest in EVs. Um, And with the new leadership and with this restructuring, then there's a prospect for a new strategy. Unifor similarly was experiencing some turbulence. The national president resigned, also amid a corruption scandal. Again, a contested leadership election, um, and all kinds of tensions and politics around investment in EVs in unionized plants in Canada. So there are similarities, there are constraints like looming restructuring, lack of clarity about investment, uncertainty about the transition, but they also had advantages, which I think are a bit surprising if in wasn't exactly what we were expecting to see. So unemployment remained low. There remained robust demand for the vehicles. And another advantage here was that the unions synchronized their bargaining periods and the expiration dates of their contracts. So the industrial action that took place was at roughly the same time. But there was more militancy in the UAW. What does that mean? Well, in the case of the UAW, it means there's a rank and file based narrative that centers the working class, that calls out elites, including the companies and President Biden, explicit reference to a just transition, and a long strike, of course. With Unifor, it was a more traditional strategy, I would say. It's a more incremental evolution of a union strategy. There was a focus on the topics and areas where they're trying to make gains, economic gains for workers, getting investment from the companies, working with government and the companies to do this. So how do we explain the shift in union strategies having to do with EV restructuring, where the UAW suddenly becomes more militant and the Canadian union, Unifor, does not? This just kind of shows the historic differences between the unions, and anyone who's been following industrial relations in these two countries is going to be aware of this. The UAW for a long time was a very labor management partnership focused union. That's one of the reasons why the Canadian union broke away from it, or the Canadian locals, and that's also part of the pitch that Sean Fain made to members when he was running as an opposition candidate to lead the UAW. So what are the theories out there? Because I only have 12 minutes, I'll just say that the most comparisons, international comparisons generally, and this one in specific, are emphasize the characteristics of national systems. Then there's another one about power resources that says that the most relevant idea from power resource theory is we would expect workers to lean on their structural power, which we do see in this case. And then there are organizational explanations, and this is what we really want to emphasize in this paper, and I think it addresses some puzzles from the other two ways of thinking about it. Crises, leadership, change strategy, those things really matter, but what's the, when do we actually see changes and variations in strategy? I think it's Levesque and Murray, they have the key, which is the strategic capabilities, which is a characteristic of unions and union bureaucracy. So the methods, we did interviews with trade unionists in auto plants and local unions and other experts in both countries. We've been following this since 2016, but this paper is about data we collected since 2021. We visited lots of plants and union offices, and we are analyzing that plus collective agreements and other written materials that came out of these struggles. So the backstory is that Unifor had crises, but it managed them. There were concessions like in the US. there were plant closures. There was real worry that the footprint of the auto industry in Canada was going to shrink drastically, corruption scandal. But at the same time, as Fred's book details, there was the deliberate development of strategic capacity. This union was created through a merger, shift from industrial union to a general union. And it's just very interesting, the thoughtfulness that went into the merger and the design of the organization. Yeah, it's a gradual incremental strategic change. The UAW, by contrast, had these crises that it could not manage: jointness, political polarization of the union, dissident caucuses, out of which CAW emerged. We find pretty weak strategic capacity from the UAW. And we hear a lot from our friends who work for the union just about how chaotic it is, how disorganized the administration caucus, the old regime was, how little time they had to prepare for bargaining and striking. Once they had new leadership, they needed shortcuts, as Chris Brooks pointed out in Labor Notes. And now there's conflict within the ruling group, the dissident group, and also between some members of that group and a federal monitor, which is supposed to be rooting out corruption. So this meant a quick strategic switch in the United States. So yeah, the UAW displayed its power. It won concessions, had a change strategy. The strike, though, was a rapid mobilization of resources by new leadership and kind of compensating for an organization broken by crises. Now this, in Unifor, is just a picture of more stability and greater capacity to deal with crises. Both of them won gains. In terms of EV production, the similarity is that they secured investment, they worked on insourcing, and they extended union coverage to new battery plants, but there are different kind of mechanics for that. So yeah, I mean, the bottom line here is that features of unions as an organization matter, and sometimes they overwhelm these system level factors that comparativists often emphasize. I think that when it comes to the future, we're going to see the effects of this difference on how at the plant level and in how these contracts actually are implemented. Many thanks.